I'm sure you've heard people say that the economy of a country is Japanifying. It may sound good, but believe me, as much as Japan is a fascinating country, if you are compared to it economically, trust me, it's not a positive thing. Japan has been stagnant for some 30 years, has only grown by 20% since the 1990s, and has a lower GDP per capita than other unenviable economies such as declining Italy. The fact is that a terrible business culture, an artificial monetary policy that keeps more than 500,000 zombie companies alive, and competition from countries like China have turned Japan from an economic miracle into an example of what not to do. Or at least that is the most widespread view. But what if it weren't true? In other words, it's true that if we talk about GDP per capita, that is, GDP divided by all citizens, the figure is a disaster. But if in the calculation we only count people of working age instead of all citizens, so if we exclude retirees and children, things change completely. In that case, Japan would grow from 0.93% to 1.44%, which would bring it almost on par with the US figure. But there is more. If we look at this growth over the last decade alone, Japan is the country in the entire G7 that has grown the most in terms of its working age population. But how is this possible? The answer is simple. Japan is the world's oldest country. By 2040, it is estimated that the population over 65 will make up a third of the total. And not surprisingly, with 1 in 3 people contributing little or nothing to the economy, it makes much more sense for them to stagnate. And so we can draw 3 conclusions from this. Number 1, Japan has not done as badly as it appears. Of course, it could have done things much better, but it doesn't seem to be the poster child for everything not to do. Number 2, declining demographics seriously affect economic development. And number 3, all other countries are now facing the same risk as Japan. For example, Japan has a fertility rate of 1.2 children per woman, but Spain's is 1.16 and South Korea's is only 0.7. In Latin America, Colombia and Brazil have a fertility rate of just 1.5, and even China, the Asian giant, has already begun to lose population. All this explains why 2023 was a historic year, perhaps the first year in human history in which the global fertility rate fell below the replacement rate, which explains news headlines like this.
America's biggest economic challenge may be demographic decline.
The big advantage, and why Japan is the focus of this video, is that they have been dealing with the problem for a long time already, and by the same token, they have been fighting it for a long time. The important thing is, what are the consequences of this demographic winter for Japan and the rest of the world? What is Japan doing to avoid it? Let's get into it. The first problem of depopulation will be in rural areas and for homeowners outside the cities. The price of a house depends on how many people want to live in a place. If there are fewer and fewer people, the less attractive places for modern living will be abandoned. This is something that we are already seeing in Spain with practically empty villages, and that Japan has known about for some time. The Japanese government already recognizes that some 900 villages are at risk of disappearing in the coming years, but the negative consequences go far beyond that. Fewer people means fewer thinking heads and fewer economies of scale. If there are fewer people, there is also less chance of a new Albert Einstein or Henry Ford being born, and a lot of infrastructure such as high-speed trains become unprofitable if there are no people to take them. Or put another way, depopulation not only means fewer and fewer workers supporting more people, it also makes these workers less productive. On top of that, an aging population also takes fewer risks. According to one study, this is already noticeable in the US, where the aging of the population has led to fewer and fewer new companies, and more concentration in existing companies. But Visualeconomik community, the main problem, the big elephant in the room, is still public debt and pensions. As you all know, in public pay-as-you-go systems, which are very common, pensions are paid with taxes from young people. The problem is that with few young people, the money runs out, and that leads to 2 consequences: tax hikes, pension cuts, and a delaying of the retirement age.
Japan approves law raising retirement age to 70.
And no, it's not that now all workers will retire at 70. But before this law, companies had a lot of discretion when it came to setting the retirement age of their workers, which discouraged people from continuing to work. To put a figure on it, almost 70% of companies had this retirement age set at 60. Now, most companies can no longer set this figure below 65. And there are new incentives for workers to keep working until 70. Thus, 40% of workers between the ages of 60 and 69 believe they will will still be working at 70. But are there other solutions? If the problem is that there will be too few workers in Japan to pay for so many pensioners, one solution would be to have pensions paid by workers in the rest of the world. This is basically what a private pension plan does. Invests workers' savings in companies around the world. But there's a huge issue with this. If that money is used to invest, then it will not be used to pay current pensions. So to implement such a system, you would have to pay double for a while. We have already told you that the demographic winter is likely to hit the whole world, and that will reduce innovation and economic growth, so pensions are bound to be lower. There is, of course, another solution. If there is a shortage of workers, why not bring them in from outside? Japan has been a nation very closed to immigration. Staying to work in the land of the rising sun has been an ordeal, even for highly skilled workers from the US or Europe. Nevertheless, things have begun to change. 30 years ago, there were only 500,000 immigrants working in Japan. Today, there are more than 3 million, and the trend has accelerated greatly in recent years. There are two reasons for this. First, the government has relaxed restrictions. For example, new visa categories for skilled workers have been approved, and programs to hire lower skilled immigrants have been expanded. And the second reason is that companies are gradually modernizing and leaving behind the rigid corporate culture that is so much criticized from outside Japan. With things like, for example, if you are new to the company, you get a very low salary. Many well-educated foreign profiles were moving to Japan to earn a junior salary simply for cultural reasons. But as this is dying out, more immigrants now prefer to move to Japan. Now the big question is, are immigrants really a solution to the demographic problem? The answer, like most things in economics, is that it depends. It depends on the type of immigrant, the taxes they pay, and the subsidies they receive. In this graph, for example, you can see whether or not different immigrant groups in Denmark are fiscally positive for the state. That is, if they contribute more than they receive. If you increase immigrants, but those immigrants only make the pension hole bigger, then you haven't solved the problem. And you may be wondering, so what kind of immigrants are the most fiscally positive? Well, basically, Western workers who don't use public education and who are still a long way from retirement. In other words, people who work hard in high value-added jobs and receive little in the way of benefits. So what's the problem? The problem is that there are very few of these ideal workers. What's more, in a developed country, it's normal for only the richest 10 to 30% to pay more than they receive. And I know what many of you are thinking. Wouldn't it be better to increase the fertility rate of the Japanese? But is that even possible? Well, take a look at this news item.
A small town in Japan doubles its fertility rate. The fertility rate rose from 1.4 to 2.8.
How did they achieve this? Well, basically, with money. We're talking about a check of $2,500 when you have a child, followed by subsidies for daycare, babysitting, healthcare. You get the picture. And we're not just talking about this town. The Japanese government is willing to fund the birth rate by any means possible and has been approving multi-billion-dollar packages for this for years. What's more, other countries have tried to subsidize the birth rate with similar policies. Hungary, for example, spends up to 5% of GDP on such programs. That's more than Spain spends on education. The outcome? Well, at first glance, it seems very positive. Hungary's fertility rate started to grow after the subsidies were approved. That is undeniable. However, just a few years later, growth began to decline to the point of becoming negative, offsetting the previous rise. Basically, people weren't having more children. They were simply having the children they planned to have, but a little earlier. So the program has been a real failure. Hungary is not an isolated case. Most academic studies agree that raising the birth rate with public aid is almost impossible, and at best, extremely expensive. For example, it's estimated that to bring the US fertility rate back to the replacement rate would require an increase in child support of $5,300 each month for the first 18 years of a child's life. Yes, you heard that correctly. We said increase because this money would have to be added to the benefits they already receive today, which range from $2,300 to $23,000 depending on the family. We've already explained the reason for this on this channel. A government can subsidize the birth rate by spending tons of money. But if the birth rate is falling, it's not because people can't afford to have children, it's because they don't want to, or at least they don't want to have them straight away. The problem is that delaying the age of motherhood means that in the end, for reasons of health, fertility, or lack of long-term couple bonds, they end up having fewer children than desired. For example, 30% of Japanese people will remain single all their lives, which is even worse if we take into account that in Japan, people don't usually have children out of wedlock. Only 2% of children were born under these circumstances, years, while in Europe and the USA, this figure ranges between 30 and 50%. Now, let me ask you, would you marry someone you don't love just because the government takes half of your income tax? The answer is clear. This is not to say that there are no economic measures that could help. There is one in particular that could be very, very positive: lowering the price of housing in cities. After all, who's going to start a family when they're still living in their parents' basement? Fortunately, the measures for solving the demographic winter do not end there. So far, we have seen possibilities for avoiding it. But if it is inevitable, could we adapt our economy to the decline? The only alternative for maintaining economic growth with a declining population is technological and productive improvement. In other words, to produce more with fewer workers. And how can we achieve this? One option is to send more people to college. Most economists believe that subsidizing college is a profitable investment for the state, especially if the aid is focused on people with less purchasing power rather than making career options free for everyone. However, there are problems with this policy as well. What you are seeing on screen is the revenue that the US government will receive after subsidizing a student's college education, minus the cost of the subsidy. Each group of bars represents the percentage of subsidy, and each color refers to the student's probability of completing the degree. The conclusions are quite clear. Subsidizing college is profitable, yes, but the higher the subsidy, the less profitable it becomes. And for some students, it may even be a negative investment. Basically, what is happening is that as the subsidy increases, less well-prepared people who are still able to take advantage of it are entering university. But there is something else to keep in mind that this study overlooks: the college premium, that is, the extra salary you earn by going to college relative to if you had not gone. The thing is, if a lot of people start going to college, this premium will fall because of pure saturation. Or to put it another way, if everyone has a degree, the degree is worth less, since going to university not only gives a better salary for the knowledge learned, but also because it is a way to differentiate yourself. So it doesn't look like this strategy is going to have many outlets either in Japan or in the rest of the developed world. Of course, there is still one hope, because if we're going to run out of natural intelligence, couldn't we invest in artificial intelligence? Take a look at this graph. Here we see what presence labor has in the South Korean economy, and what presence it would have if there had not been so many improvements in software. Over the past 30 years, improvements in computer software account for around half of the decline in the presence of labor in the economy. The hope of many analysts is that, with the advent of artificial intelligence and other advances such as robotics, the burden of labor will fall even further. This, of course, without lowering total GDP. Thanks to technology, we workers are more productive. We generate more wealth in the same amount of time. We can work fewer hours and earn better wages. And who knows, there are people who argue that artificial intelligence will soon cease to be an accessory that makes us more productive and will work directly for us. Leaving out the more novel scenarios, to what extent could artificial intelligence compensate for the demographic winter? According to Darren Acemoglu, one of the world's most quoted economists, we should not be too optimistic. Acemoglu estimates that artificial intelligence will increase productivity by about 0.06% each year. Doing a little math, this means that GDP will be almost 8% higher in 60 years than if AI did not exist. And let's see, 8% is not bad, but it is nowhere near enough to compensate for the fall in the working population. However, many economists have criticized Acemoglu's estimate. This estimate relies too much on extrapolating what AIs like ChatGPT are doing today into the future, but it seems pretty obvious that the growth of artificial intelligence is going to go much further than what we currently understand. How much further? Well, nobody knows. What we do know is that in order to combat the demographic winter, it would have to mean an increase in productivity as never seen before. And that is something very complicated. We'd be talking about improvements greater than those of the steam engine or the first computers.
Labor productivity has grown in the leading economies at the best times in their history at 1.9% per year. With a working-age population falling to 1.0% or 1.5%, it is virtually impossible for GDP to grow at more than 1% per year, no matter how many times one repeats artificial intelligence. It is pure accounting.
Although, who knows? We don't want to be apocalyptic either. You never know what the future holds, and it wouldn't be the first time humans have come out stronger from situations that seemed hopeless. dangerous. But having come this far, it's up to you. To what extent is Japan a harbinger of what lies ahead for the rest of the world? What further steps do you think countries could take to reverse this demographic trend? Will artificial intelligence end up being our savior? You can leave me your answer in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.